Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters Podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back, everyone. We are going to finish off our three-part episode on the big three in relationships. And so today, part 3 of 3 is extended family. And this issue can be a little bit more complicated in that it involves more than just the couple. It involves other people. So if there was a subtitle to this episode, it would be boundaries, because I think
that's
boundaries,
right. Yes.
Because when it comes to extended family, boundaries are so important. So let's just start by kind of breaking down why it's so complicated, why in-laws can be so complicated.
Well, that's one of my favorite words in my office is boundaries.
Yeah.
Because I really think it is important. So why is it complicated? You know, I thought a little bit about this. Why is it hard? And I think it comes down to basically I always see families. So in this case, you know, you have two people come together and they each come from a family of origin. I always look at that almost like a mini culture. Mm-hmm. And so, because if you think about how you grow up, you know, there are traditions you might have around holidays, birthdays, meals, what's food, what types of food you eat are different. And so, you know, there are all these aspects of a family of origin that are, you know, in some ways it can be unique to that family of origin, but some of those aspects are also shared by other families. So you bring these two people together who come from these different mini cultures, and you throw them together, and I think in some ways it's a clash of cultures. Mm-hmm. And so as I was thinking about what might be important to help couples understand is that sometimes, you know, what I've seen, and this is based on what I've seen in my office, some people come in thinking their way or how they were raised, so essentially their family of origin, is the right way. Mm-hmm. For instance, how we celebrated Christmas or how we celebrated Hanukkah or, you know, Passover, or any of those types of religious holidays, or how we celebrated birthdays, what we did on vacation, how we did vacation. It's the right way. And so I think it's really important when you're thinking of entering into a relationship or in the relationship, it's not about, you can't just say my way is the right way. Mm-hmm. Or there's going to be some difficulty.
Yeah.
So, you know, I don't know if it's my second favorite word other than boundaries. It goes back to communication. And I think in some previous episodes, I've mentioned this book. It's called Lies at the Altar, and chapter 9, I think it is, Eyes Wide Open, but it has 267 questions to ask before you get married. And I think that can be really, really helpful in determining what are our attitudes about different things. Now, how does this tie into family of origin? Well, I think that it's the expectations. And I may have mentioned this before previously, that most couple issues or problems really that comes down to unfulfilled expectations.
Yeah.
So I get married and I think, we're going to do, let's take Christmas. We're going to do Christmas this certain way. And then I find out, well, my spouse doesn't really want to do Christmas that way. And so, you know, all of a sudden there's a conflict, and that's my expectation isn't being fulfilled. So one way to change that is to have good dialogue. And as a couple, you come up with expectations that are the couples. Essentially, what you're doing is you're creating a new mini culture by coming together.
Yeah.
So one of the important things for couples to understand is that their relationship, so the marriage relationship, I think, is the primary relationship. It's not your relationship with your parents. It's not your relationship with your siblings. Once you choose to commit to a marriage or a long-term relationship, then you have changed the important relationship in your life to be that partner or spouse that you're with.
Yeah. So I was given a piece of very, very good advice shortly before I got married. And this advice came from my stake president, which, for those of you who aren't familiar, he's a religious leader. And he said, never talk bad about your spouse to your parents. And his reasoning for that was, you may, in a moment of frustration, vent to your mom or your dad about something that's going on with your spouse. And then later on down the road, in your mind, you let it go, but they're still thinking about it. And so he said to us, always talk about your spouse in the best possible light. Make your parents think that you have got the best husband or wife on the earth. Always do that. And I've found it to be extremely beneficial. And I've kind of made my own thing with it, where parents belong very much in your life, but they very much do not belong in your marriage.
That's right.
Yeah.
I agree with everything you've said. I think that, if you say negative things to your parents about your spouse, I have never seen that work out well.
Yeah.
And so that's really good advice. I don't know that you need to necessarily sugarcoat it and say everything's great, because often things aren't. But I think here's maybe the first boundary that we talk about is it's okay to say, we're having some difficulties and we're working on it, and you leave it at that. That's it.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of parents will say, well, tell me about it. And I would respond, well, we're having some difficulties and we're working on it. And you can just go back to the same thing. So you can let them know, what's going on. But I don't think giving the details is ever
appropriate.
Helpful. No. And so I think that it's the communication, it's the commitment to each other that you are going to work on the problems as a couple, and maybe you'll seek outside help. Through a counselor. But also, I think that another one of those mini culture issues is, how comfortable are you talking about your personal life with others? And I think there's great variation in that. And so some people are very comfortable about having their life be out there, for everyone to see, and others are not. And so in a couple, I think that where you go is you go to the one who has the most discomfort in sharing. And so that becomes the boundary. If I'm really uncomfortable talking about any of our personal stuff to anyone else, and I think as a couple, that's where you go. Yeah. Maybe you're both comfortable talking about it, then that's fine. But I still think what you said about negative comments to families of origin is important. I think the same thing probably applies to siblings. I mean, that I don't know that it's that helpful to talk about siblings or to talk to your siblings in a negative way. So that's just one of those things that you'd want to talk about. So I tried to think of the different areas where this becomes a problem, where you're going to need some boundaries. So the first one that I thought about were expectations from the family of origin. Often the parents, sometimes the siblings, but it's that expectation of, you as a couple will spend the holidays with us, or you as a couple will come every Sunday evening to our family dinner. So it's the expectations about time spent together and holidays. And I've certainly seen it, or had people tell me that a lot of pressure is often put on the couple to meet those expectations. And so what's important is, if both people in the couple, in the marriage, want to do that, great. But usually that's not the case. Not the case. And also what I found is, say it's my parents who are asking to, come over every week. Often it's the child themselves who has a very hard time saying no. To the parent, and the other person is just saying, well, why don't you say no, not this week? and the child themselves just can't do that. Then that goes back to, I think, some dynamics in the family of origin. But again, as a couple, you're forming this new relationship. You decide this relationship, this marriage is the most important thing. What do we want? I think I use the term team a lot, but I see that. I think that as a couple, we need to be a team. We need to be a team in relation to each of our families of origin. We need to be a team in sexuality that we talked about last week. We need to be a team in finances, things like that. So, being a team around it, talking about it. The other, so that's one thing, expectations from family of origin about time. The other is, sadly, often our parents or our siblings may have some behaviors that are problematic.
Yeah.
For instance, how they might, things they might say to others. Sometimes they might, I've seen couples where they talk about their families, they're really teasing or they're controlling, or they say things that are negative. Sometimes, sadly, again, people grow up in families where there's a fair amount of negativity, and that gets continued, as adults. And as a newly married couple, no kids, maybe you can tolerate that, although I wouldn't ever recommend it. Yeah. But the real problem comes, I think, is when you have children. If you decide to have children, then you have to decide, okay, how am I going to approach this with my parent or my spouse's parent when they're saying inappropriate things or behaving inappropriately towards my children? And so that's where I think the boundaries come in.
Yeah. And Curtis and I have been fortunate in a lot of ways in respects to in-laws. And this is, I guess, it's both a blessing and a curse in that we grew up in different states. And so our families live in different states. And for up until recently, we lived in a completely different state from either parent. So I mean, there was never that fight of, where do we go for birthdays and holidays and all that stuff? And because, it was kind of predetermined. But, as I've thought about it, if there was ever an event, like if there was ever a time where we were all together for Christmas, it'd just be one big happy shindig. Both families would come together and there'd be food and, and that would be the end of it. And Curtis and I have always been pretty fortunate in that regards. But that's also pretty rare.
Yeah, Liz, you've got to know that's rare. I mean, it's a great thing. I mean, that's the way I think most of us would want it, but it doesn't happen very often.
No. And again, it probably stems from the fact that we live in different states. And another thing I think is worth bringing up is, so when you do have behaviors that are not appropriate, or if there is a conflict of, where do we spend the holiday? I think it's important that whoever's spouse's parents are the ones having the issue, that child needs to talk to their parents. Right. So, for example, if it were my parents setting an expectation and Curtis disagreed with it, it's my job to talk about it and resolve it. There should never be a situation where Curtis needs to talk to my parents about something. That should almost always be my responsibility.
I agree with that. And I think that the first step, which maybe is implied here, is you and Curtis decide what
exactly.
You and Curtis, together decide as a team what the response is. And then I think you're right that the child of the parents who have the issue should take the lead because it's going to be so much easier. Because otherwise, I've seen this a lot. The parents think, it's the spouse who is forcing this, and you cause some sort of negative reaction that way, or resentment to build up. When really, if the child themselves is the one saying, this is what we have decided to do, then it's much easier. So maybe we could talk about behaviors. I get this question, or boundaries, about how to set a boundary. So I'm going to give an example.
Okay.
And so let's say that one parent or one set of parents has some negative behavior in the way they talk. And either they talk negative or they often they're putting their own child down because that's kind of the way the family of origin was.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get married and the spouse sees this, often the spouse has an incredibly negative reaction to that, right? So the spouse is in love with this other person and they experience the parents being negative. So and you want to change it. So as a couple, you decide, how are we going to change that? Here's what you do. Here's one example. So you can talk to the parents and you say, this is the behavior that we don't like. And you spell it out.
Mm-hmm.
You're very direct about what it is. And we'd like you to try and change that because it doesn't feel good to us. So here's what we're going to do. If we're here visiting, and this behavior happens, the negative talk, then we're going to say, do you remember we talked about this? So we're going to leave now and we'll come back next week and hopefully you can make a different choice. And you don't have to get angry about it. I think it's important that you don't get angry. You just, what you've done is you've set an expectation. They then violated the expectation and say, okay, we're going to leave now, but we'll come back and hopefully you'll make a better choice. Now, if they want to see you and if they want to have that association, I almost invariably they'll change the behavior, but it may take several weeks in order to do that. And I think it's important that, you don't get mad. You don't say, I'm never coming back again, which isn't going to be the case. You just say, this isn't okay. Please don't do it. And we'll come back and try it again next week. I think you can use that kind of model with a lot of behaviors. We had a question on the radio program a couple of weeks ago with grandparents who were giving the kid like food that the parents didn't want. I think they were feeding them caffeine. They were, which I can certainly understand how the parents wouldn't want that. And so you can do the exact same thing with that. You can say, if you do this again, we aren't going to bring our child over to see you. So you get to decide, how you behave. And so you can set that expectation. So that's something I try and help couples understand, is that instead of being frustrated, sometimes you need to set a good boundary.
Yeah. And I think kids can further throw in a complicating factor because, on the one hand, grandparents, in my opinion, they have earned the right to all the joys of parenthood without having to deal with the not so joys of parenthood, right? They've raised their kids and grandkids are wonderful. And I feel like my parents, they've certainly earned time with my kids to have fun and do the fun things. And I get to be the parent and do the hard stuff. But there has to also be a mutual understanding of respect. And that, I'm entrusting you to watch my children and I want my children to be able to spend time with you. But I also trust that you're not going to do things that are unhealthy, or you're not going to load them completely chock full of sugar without, a proper meal. So there has to be that mutual understanding to some extent.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm a grandparent. I have 4 grandkids that I see regularly. And I always think that the parents have the final say. And for both me and Lindy, if we ever have a question, we always ask. So here's something, this happened just last night. It's an example. Okay. So on Fridays, we have the kids after school. And so we get, these kids love those. Have you ever seen the chocolate chip muffins from Costco?
Yeah.
These big muffins, and I guess they're really chocolatey. So the kids love these. And so after dinner, we have them, and everybody was here for dinner, the parents as well. And they always like to know what they get for their dessert after. So I said, well, here, you can have an ice cream bar, or you can have half. And I said this, half of a chocolate muffin. And my oldest grandson said, no, I really want a whole one. Can I have a whole one? And my response was, well, your mom and dad are going to be here in about 15 minutes and they can decide. So, he wasn't very happy with that. I mean, ultimately, mom decided half of a chocolate muffin. But I think for grandparents, yes, if, we do get to enjoy a lot of those aspects of having raised our kids, and we don't have to have a lot of the responsibility. For me, it's really important to follow whatever the parents of the children want and be respectful. You mentioned the word respect. I think that's it exactly, is that you have to be respectful.
And I think my parents, as well as my in-laws, have largely done the same thing. And in a way, it almost bugs me when I see those things, or when people are like, well, I'll just call and ask grandma. If mom says no, I'll call grandma. And it's like, no, that's not the way this works. And my parents.
You mean children actually say that? I'll call and ask grandma.
I've seen memes on the
Oh
internet,
my
or like, or
gosh.
t-shirts. Yeah, or it's like this t-shirt, I'll just ask grandma and she'll say yes. And it's like, no.
Yeah, as a parent, I'd say, no, that's not happening.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I'm like, no, that's not how it works. And my parents have said, because I mean, kids will try anything, you know.
Yeah.
And they've tried it before. They've tried going and seeing if they get a different answer from grandma and grandpa. And my parents and my in-laws have respectfully said, no. Mom and dad said no. So the answer's no. It's an important dynamic, and like you said, respecting boundaries.
I feel incredibly fortunate as a grandparent to have my grandkids at least 2 days, out of the week, sometimes more. And part of that, I think part of the reason that their parents certainly trust us with them is that we follow their guidelines and what they want, and we're respectful of their wishes. So, but getting back to boundaries, as parents, I think you do have the right to be the ones in charge of what happens with your kids. And so if some of the grandparents, or it could be even aunts and uncles, I think you get to say, you don't just, because they're your family of origin, you don't just say, oh, well. So that's how I would set boundaries, using that particular model. This next point, I think, kind of goes back to what you said about don't speak negatively, say, to your parents or siblings about your spouse. I think no matter what, we are always somewhat, defensive or protective. I don't know what the word would be, defensive or protective of our families of origin. Even if we can see, oh, that particular behavior doesn't work very well. Often it's easier if I'm the one talking about my family of origin and saying, this is a behavior that doesn't work very well. If the spouse is the one always bringing it up, even though you might see it, it's hard. So in one of the next episodes coming up, I think we're going to talk more about communication, and we'll go into more detail about how I would approach that as a couple, because I think that having the dialogue around families of origin, it's going to be really important not to be defensive. And I do believe that we can train ourselves to not be defensive, because then it just goes into, I can listen to you better if I'm not being defensive.
Yeah.
But again, I think it's just a realization for everyone. It's harder to hear it from someone else than to say it yourself about your family of origin.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I mean, particularly if there's unhealthy things going on in a relationship, and, a spouse comes into a marriage and realizes, are you aware that this isn't how it's supposed to be? I think that can be incredibly difficult, and would be a really good topic to hit on next week with communication. So I would like to say that my perspective as being a daughter-in-law and my husband being a son-in-law, one of the things that I have always appreciated about both my parents and my husband's parents is that they have been really good about accepting and respecting who we have decided to be as a couple, like you mentioned earlier. And I think that is just crucial to having a good relationship with your extended family, because kids are going to grow up, they're going to leave the house, and they're going to get married. And it is crucial to understand and accept that they're adults and they're going to make their own decisions, and they may not live the exact lifestyle that you raise them to, but you have to be respectful and accept and understand that. And that can be incredibly hard for parents, I think, but it's something that my parents have done, and it's something I've appreciated, because it's made getting together with them and seeing them a lot easier, and spending time with them is significantly easier.
I agree with that. And I say this to a lot of people. Your adult children will always do things you disapprove of. And so, I have 4 adult children, and some are partnered and married and kids. And so they make choices that I wouldn't make, but it's not me, it's their life. And so I agree with you. It's really important to allow them to become the individuals that they are. But then I think the question arises, well, what happens if you have parents who are really pushing against that, who try, I suppose this would be the controlling parent or the controlling grandparent. And I certainly see that. And here's the dynamic that gets created, because it's a dynamic that continues from the family of origin. So typically, if you have controlling grandparents or controlling parents as adults, they were that way when the children were younger too. And so the one partner in the marriage has grown up thinking that this is the way it is. And it's typically really difficult for them to confront that behavior, confront that control, and say no. So when, there's always with kids and parents growing up, there's always a difference in the power, right? Parents are always more powerful than the children are. And so it's hard, if you're a 10-year-old and maybe you can see that your parents aren't doing something right, it's really hard to confront them. You can't say, hey, don't treat me that way. But then that's the way the relationship exists for over 25 years. And all of a sudden at 25, you're married and your parents step in and they're trying to do the same thing to you. But now you're married, and often that control extends to your spouse. I'm going to try and control the marriage. That is a very difficult situation, which, sadly, again, I've seen happen many times. And the biggest problem is the other spouse sees it and says, this isn't quite right. The person who grew up in that particular environment says, well, this is what I'm used to, or, something like that.
Yeah.
And it goes back to, one of the first things we said at the start of this episode is you've got to be a team. What do we want? And so you start the dialogue of what do we want and how do we get that, or how do we put the boundary in place? And it may mean confronting your parents and helping them, hopefully, to change that controlling behavior. Sometimes parents won't change that behavior, though.
And then what do you do?
So I run into this often. And I think that there's this, obviously we have a very strong connection to our family of origin.
Right.
But I have had some people, express this verbally, that they think because they're family, we put up with anything. Now, this is going to be my own, maybe this is my own thought on this, my own bias. I don't think that's true. I think
not fair.
Well, it's not fair to both people in the couple.
Yeah.
I think that we don't have to put up with, if there's really awful behavior, which sometimes there is from our families of origin, we don't have to put up with that. And in an extreme case, if you've tried the boundary setting and they aren't responding to that, I think in the extreme case, the ultimate boundary is, I'm not going to see you because you're harmful to us. You're harmful to me. You're toxic. Toxic is the word I use. There was this is an old book that's called Toxic Parents, I think was the name of it. And it talked about this very thing, but it's probably out of print. It's sold. But that doesn't happen very often. And I want to acknowledge something I've acknowledged before. I see the couples and the families that are struggling.
Right.
So I do want to acknowledge there are so many families, hundreds of thousands of families out there that do well.
Oh yeah.
We're just talking about the families in an extreme case where the behavior won't change. And I think ultimately, if it won't change, you don't put up with it. I think that's especially true if you have children, because you want to break that pattern, because typically it's a pattern that has existed over several generations. And so I try and help people see that you can be the generation where this ends, but you may not be able to see your parents.
Right. And I would imagine that's pretty rare that parents would say, yeah, it's pretty rare, because most parents love their kids. They want to be around them and they want to be around their grandkids. Thanks, everyone. Next week, we are going to talk about, communication. It felt like a very appropriate next topic, because
we'll just do a deep dive into communication.
Yeah, deep dive into communication. So we will talk to you all then.
Have a good week.
Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.